With that. Hello, and we're with the architects coach, and this is Reena Tiwari, who's a professor at Curtin University, and it's one of my long-term acquaintances from the 1980s. We used to sit on the lawn and have lunch together in the 1980s, at least once or twice, and we also used to see each other in the library in the town planning and architecture crossover. And I think at that time, Rena, you were recently moved to Australia. Is that right? Yes.
Yes, I had just migrated to Australia and I was enrolled as a PhD student. I was doing some tutorials and lectures. So I guess, yeah, very new.
And you had done your PhD way back then in the 80s, not recently like me.
Oh, well, I finished my PhD in 2003 or 4.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah,
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 so we possibly worked together when I worked at Curtin later in the
yep.
90s. Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah, that's correct.
I'm a West Australian born man, and I'm very interested in the history of Indigenous people in Australia. And I remember when I was younger, I was sort of horrified to learn that only 2 years after I was born in 1967 did Aboriginal people become citizens of Australia. Because, as you know, Australia was a colonial setup where the people who lived in Western Australia originally weren't really asked about. There was no treaty made about occupation by Britain, and I'm now a British person as well, so I've got a double allegiance in a way. And I'm very interested in this. The question when I used to be at Curtin, also I taught with some Noongar lecturers, and we tried to increase people's understanding and awareness of the indigenous culture. I learnt some of the language. I don't get to use it very much in London, unfortunately, but I love the opportunity to learn more about Noongar culture, which is the country around Perth. I was saying to someone the other day in a brief chat in an introduction online that my country is called Boorloo, which is the original name of Perth, which was renamed after a Scottish town by Scottish settlers. And then also the river, which is called the Swan River, which is the main feature of the area, is called Gerbil Yerrigan, which was much easier to say for the colonists. Just call it a swan because there was a swan there or
Fun.
something.
Yeah.
So, and Reena, you've been working on this amazing Missions Connect project. I think, is that the right name for it?
Yeah, it's called Missions Connect. Basically, it's about connecting the survivors as well as the broader Australians back to the missions through the stories. And surprisingly, not many people know about the stolen generations trauma
Mm.
in the missions. If they know about it, they know it through a very kind of a colonial lens, the stories that they have heard. It's a very colonial perspective that they have um, heard so far. So I guess this whole Missions Connect project was to communicate the stories of trauma, stories of resilience, through the survivors. So, bringing the survivors' voices to the Indigenous community as well as to the non Indigenous community. So, that is how the whole project started.
I see. So, would it be right to say that before the Indigenous citizenship in 1967, that the state was able to move children away from their families and to put them into either religious or state-owned childcare or family situations
Mm,
without really having proper permission of the parents. So that's why they're called the stolen generation,
yeah.
and it was made famous, I guess, in some films like The Rabbit Proof Fence, possibly in the 90s as well. And it's, as you say, Stolen Generations is not a very well known story, maybe even in Australia, let alone outside Australia. So I find it very important to be able to tell Europeans when they ask me what's happening in Australia or what's happening with the Indigenous people, that there is something actually revisiting that history and re-looking at
Mm.
how we told the stories about stolen generations.
Yeah, and you're so right. The removal of the children, the indigenous children, from their parents, the forcible removal, I would say,
Mm,
that has a long history. It dates back to, I think, Perth Native School, 1840.
right.
But it was enshrined into a policy uh, through an Indigenous Act by A.O. Neville in
Right.
1905.
Mm,
And I guess it was also about that kind of A.O. Neville's thinking represents the thinking at the time of um, many of the white Australians, um, that the Aboriginal people could be a danger. And there is, quite a lot of literature where the word contamination
right.
is used as well. Um, Special problem was with the half castes, that is, because they were neither black nor white. So, what do we do about that? So, I guess it was about the breeding out color, that was behind it, breeding out that particular race, breeding out.
Mm,
Uh, uh, that was behind that whole removal, um, forcible removal of the indigenous children from their parents. But I would like to talk about three stories because,
mm,
we have been working with the survivors both from Mogamamor River as well as Karalap Marybank mission sites. So these mission sites, as we and I don't know how many people would know about it, but there were around 50 or so mission sites within Australia, within Western Australia
Western
itself.
Australia.
So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, yep.
So,
So,
so
which were either
just
state run or church run.
yeah, for context, you're sitting in Perth, in the capital city of Western Australia, and then
Yeah,
some of the communities were quite remote. It's a very big state, so it goes right up to the border to Northern Territory. It's thousands
Northern
of kilometres.
Territories.
It's almost as far
Yes,
as going to the east
yeah,
coast. And then
yeah.
you've even going. I had my family visiting Esperance the other day,
Mm,
and even
mm,
that's quite a long way. It's nearly a thousand
yeah,
kilometres
yeah,
down to the southern part, so it's a
yeah,
very huge state. And the
yeah.
places that you mentioned, Moore River, Carrolup, are in the basic vicinity of the southwest,
Yes.
which is the area
So,
where I was
Carolop,
mentioning earlier. Yeah, around the
yeah.
river. Yeah.
Yeah. So Karlap Marybank would be about 3 hours drive from Perth,
Right.
whereas Mogambourmo River is about 1.5 hours
Right.
drive from
Okay.
Perth. So that kind of gives you that location. But generally, the stories that we hear are about, quite a lot about trauma and abuse. Uh, well, these mission places carry a kind of a mix of emotions because, of course, they were places of abuse, both sexual and physical abuse, emotional abuse, but also they were places which the indigenous kids knew as home. They were the only homes. So they were brought there as a 2-year-old, and then they were left, they were asked to leave basically the missions when they were 14, 15 years old. So it's, all their childhood spent away from their families, from their culture, from their community, from their language
Right.
in these missions. However, that is where they grew the small little friendships with the other indigenous kids and so on. So those were the places that they knew as home as well. So very mixed kind of emotions these places carry for the survivors. But I would, do you mind if I read out three
I would love
stories
that. Yeah,
of the
I would love that.
survivors? Yeah,
I just wanted to say also
yeah,
that I think the thing about Western Australia as a state, although it's so large, it was also a mosaic of many different cultures and languages. And I think we forget that when the people were put into those missions, they would be put into non-aligned language groups. So, for example, people from Yamaji country, a couple of hundred kilometers away, would be put into a Noongar group, and so
Yep.
they would be expected to either speak English or learn some
Yep.
way of communicating. And so, apart from all the sexual and physical and the mental and emotional abuse, you've also got this kind of forced culture, where institutional culture, where there's no recognition of local origins of language even. So that's
Yep.
that's probably in terms of language education and understanding Indigenous studies in Western Australia, that was putting the brakes on even understanding the language and difference between, say, Yamaji from further inland and Noongar from around the Swan River area. So I just wanted to put that one in there, because I thought a lot of people might not realise the incredible diversity of language and culture within Western Australia before colonisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that point has come out very strongly in one of the survivors' stories. And maybe, I'll read that one out first. What the survivor says is, when he was asked to leave at the age of 16. So he was brought in here as a 2-year-old. He was asked to leave at 16. So he says, it left a gap in my life from the age of 2 to age 16 and even beyond. When I went back to my hometown, life had to start all over again. I had to readjust into life in my own community. I didn't speak like my own families. I didn't act like them. I was like an outcast, so to speak. So he's speaking about his own family. It was so hard to adjust. But on the other side, he says that the mission kids, they were my family, because they could understand. We could talk to each other. Because we had gone through the similar history, so we could understand each other. So they became his family rather than his own family, which is pretty strong.
Yeah, a sort of institutionally concocted family. It would have a religious or a state. In that particular case, would it have been a Catholic or Anglican? Or
it was a Catholic.
A Catholic one.
And he says about, the way he was raised with the Catholic values and so on. So basically stripping off the culture, the identity, the language, that's what happened, so that the person couldn't really readjust in his own family. So I guess that is one of the points. The other point was about, the kind of trauma and abuse, which is a story repeated in nearly all the missions, which is also a story repeated in many of the Canadian residential schools. Because in 2020, we also went to meet with the Blackfoot community and the Cree community in Canada. And, the stories that were coming out were very, very similar, even in the US residential schools. So, there is that kind of a pattern. And I would read another story, the second one, which is about trauma and abuse, where she says the girls could not go to the toilet alone. The men would watch us. I went to the toilet, and when I came out, a man was standing in the toilet with his trousers to his knee. The school was the only place us girls felt safe. We were called little black kids with no future. So that's the kind of thing that was taking place, right? After all of that, you find that there is still that strength and resilience being shown in in many of the survivors, the way they have come out. And I'll just read one paragraph, one story, the third story. So he says, my life went to the gutter. I went to every prison in Perth. I got caught up on the wrong side of life. And he also talks about, I took drugs. On the bottom of the methylated spirits, it says poison, and I drank it. But one day I made a decision. I said, do you want to live the life that you lived in the mission with my Christian values? So I picked myself up and I stopped drinking and I stopped doing drugs. I found myself a partner and I still live with her today after 30 years. I ended up with a license, a car, my own home, becoming school teacher, a job at Centrelink. So there is a positive and a negative in everyone's life. It's the choice that we make which will pick our destination. So here he talks about how completely had gone down and how he picked up from there. You also find a kind of a mix in terms of their response to the Christian or the Catholic teachings.
Yes.
Some of the survivors really hated the church within the mission side. They really didn't want anything to do with it. And they just, Whereas this particular person actually talks about the Christian values. So there is kind of, quite a mix of responses that come out.
That's amazing. I think that story where you're saying that the man actually used the Christian values, which in a sense had abused him, or the people and the institution which had abused him, he still could see beyond that and was able to see a wider general sort of transformative possibility to come back and to be human again. And I mean that says a lot. That says so much about human spirit, and as you said, resilience. I think resilience, to be beaten down so badly and then to come back, is just incredible.
But Greg, there are so many of these stories, and it's not the first time that they have been recorded or so on, these stories have been recorded. So quite a lot of research has already been done. These stories are published as well. The libraries have it, the National Archives, State Archives, all of them have it. What we did was bring the stories or connect the stories back to the places where they happened.
Right.
So that is what the whole mission's connected. So what we did was, say, for example, Mogambar Moor River site, the mission site. When you go there, out of the 40 odd buildings that used to be there, so the site began, the whole thing started from 1918 onwards. So out of those 40 odd buildings, there are only 7 or 8 buildings that are there at the site. So the rest, it's all not there. Nothing is there, right? So a place means quite a lot in many ways. So what we did was we actually went through quite a lot of historical research, went through maps and documents and plans and so on. And then we recreated that entire mission site in different phases in a virtual reality environment.
Right.
But while doing so, we were working with the survivors all the time. So basically, the recreation of the site was led by the survivors, because they used to do the lived maps. That, the building used to be like this, or the colors used to be like that, the furniture used to be like that, or, this building was not there at the time, and so on. So it is not just the historical research that has been taken on board. It's the mental mapping. It's the memory mapping that we have taken from the survivors. So how the survivors saw those mission sites in different periods, right? So say, for example, Mogambar Moor River, we did a 1960s virtual reality environment. because quite a lot of survivors who we were able to access and for their stories and so on were from 1960s, right? Like had lived there in 1960s. So we have recreated all of that. And when you actually go into the virtual reality environment, when you are putting on the glasses and you travel through that virtual reality environment, you see how the mission site was. But you also walk into the sound bubble. So you hit sound bubble, and then you start hearing the survivor talking about these stories, which I just read out, actually in the places where they happened. So if we are talking about, something happening at the kitchen or the dining or, the activity that used to take place in there at the dining table, how it was and so on. So it is over there, exactly at that spot that the story is related with that person's voice. So, and that's the way you actually make it authentic and make sure that it's not, the meaning is still there. It's not transformed because it is well connected to the site, to the place. So, the context and the story, it's together, it's coming from the survivor himself or herself. So I guess that is what makes the work a little bit different from the others. Number two, also, when you are going through the virtual reality environment, for each of the building, you actually hit an information pole and you start hearing about how the building was used or how it was constructed and so on. So more information about the buildings themselves. So in a way, it actually documents the heritage. So it's a digital documentation of the heritage of that significant period of Australian Aboriginal history, I would say. So those are the couple of things that have been done in this work.
So by visiting the environment virtually and to see the building context and everything, then you can try to put yourself into that person's shoes and try to experience it, to develop a kind of empathy or a kind of understanding of those people, perhaps more than you would if you're reading a book or when you see these accounts. It's relatively easy to other people by just listening and saying, well, that was then and that was what they used to do in those days, and now you're being asked to maybe challenge that a little bit and saying, if I was in this situation, what would I do?
Yeah.
Seeing someone standing there, or I'm sitting on the toilet and somebody's standing with their trousers down. It's such a horrible thought.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sounds very powerful. Yeah.
So
I'd love to visit.
I guess, Greg, I think, you hit the spot there where you talk about building empathy, being in their shoes and building empathy. I think that's what needed to happen. And it all started with when we had taken our students to work on one of the mission sites, and we were just doing retrofitting that site as a healing center. So for that, we were documenting the site and we were looking at, okay, how much expenditure it would require and what are the things that would need to be retrofitted and so on. So that's the reason we were documenting, and we were also digitally documenting. And then a problem occurred in terms of the lease and ownership side of the things. And as you know that, because there are traditional owners,
right,
but the stolen generations, they came from all over the place, as you just pointed out. So the mission kids came from all over. So there is that kind of a tension as well, right? So there was that problem. And so what happened was we had done the digital documentation and we did a fly through. And when the survivors saw that, they started talking about, oh, do you remember that? Or do you remember this? And so on. And that's when we thought, oh my God, here they are talking about it, crying, laughing at some of the things just by going through that, So we said, this could be a powerful tool in terms of healing as well, where the survivors can come together, where they can actually share their stories with their kids and grandkids and take them through those sites.
So
Where
it gives really form to some of the stories and the memories that people have, and it reinforces those stories, even if they're not pleasant stories. It enables them to revisit that traumatic time. But I guess there may be positive stories, as you said. It's not all negative, but it's just somebody's life, and they can revisit that with their grandchildren or their children. That's really important.
But obviously this has got risks as well, because there is a risk of causing trauma, triggering trauma again.
Right. Yeah.
So obviously this has to happen in a safe space, and that is why it's under Aboriginal control. So we have partnered with the Aboriginal organization, and these things are under their control. So they actually, make sure that enough of peer support is there whenever they are holding these yarning sessions with the Aboriginal survivors and their families. So they make sure about that. Yes, the healing side of the things, the trauma trigger risk of that has to be taken care of. But on the other side, within this virtual reality tool, we have made sure that we have the proper access controls and locks, so that some of the stories are not accessible to, say, for example, primary school children, So age-wise, you can actually do access control.
So kind of safeguarding of young people as well through those access controls. And I just want to pick up when you said about yarning sessions. That might be something for the European listeners who might not be familiar. So yarning session is like an unstructured talking session. Is that right?
Yeah, yarning session.
That's a particularly, it sounds like a sort of an Aboriginal concept, but it's where you can talk about something without having a particular dialogue or a monologue. Anyway, sort of an open-ended talking session.
Yeah, it's more like, it starts with a story, and then, that has linked to another thing and so on. So, it's a very cyclic thing. It's never a linear kind of a discussion with the beginning agenda and an end outcomes. It's never like that, as we all know. It's more like, one story after the other. It goes on, and, people find relief. Sometimes people reflect on certain things and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a lovely idea. That's so interesting. Yeah, it would be so nice to visit those virtual places. And can we see some of the information background on the web? Is there a place to see any information at Curtin University or somewhere?
Yes, so we have got a website.
Okay.
It's missionsconnect.net.
Okay.
And on that, whatever work has been done so far has been kept in there. So yes, people will be able to get some information. There's another aspect, Greg, about it, which is about, remember, with the Aboriginal traditional owners. So if you're going to another country, so say, for example, Noongar country and then another country. So if you move, then you have to take permission. Within the Aboriginal communities, they wouldn't rather go to another country uninvited, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So like within the Aboriginal community, there are all these kinds of things, right? So how do you maintain some of these things within the virtual reality environment? Because virtual reality environment can be accessed by anyone. So how do you still maintain that, the permission side of the things? Also, when we were constructing this whole thing, it was about, say, when we go to a heritage site, you actually pay for it, pay for looking at the thing, right? How do you manage that in here? And can a system be devised so that the payment goes directly to the Aboriginal communities involved in that particular process?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
That
So I guess, those are some of the challenges that, this whole digital thing, because digitally, anyone can access anytime and so on. The data can easily be misinterpreted sometimes and so on. So those were some of the challenges that we were working with in terms of creating the virtual.
Like you say, there's controls, but also maybe sort of greeters or advocates or guides who could be there even digitally to help you to interpret things. As you would if you were visiting from one country to another, you might go with an interpreter or somebody who knows the local culture and who would help to interpret. And I think that's a really interesting development in future for tourism in Australia, for people to understand Aboriginal culture.
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea to have that kind of interpreter within the virtual reality environment. Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for speaking. It's so interesting. I'm going to go and look at missionsconnect.net is the website. And this has been Reena Tiwari, Professor Reena Tiwari at Curtin University. Missions Connect. It's been so interesting talking about this. Thank you. And
Thanks,
I'm looking
Greg.
forward to talking again soon.
Thanks, Greg, for having me. Bye to the listeners.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.